If the flood in Genesis really happened, then where are the ruins it left behind? Archaeologists have searched the deserts, the seafloors, and the shadows of ancient mountains for centuries, and what they're beginning to find might rewrite everything we thought we knew about Noah's world. Because across continents, from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf, buried cities are surfacing, and many of them tell the same story, a story of sudden destruction, of a flood that came too fast to escape, and of a civilization advanced enough to leave behind stone, art, and memory. But here's the problem. If Noah was supposed to be the last survivor, how did these cities exist at all? Long before the Ark, the world was not empty. The Bible says the sons of God saw the daughters of men and took them as wives. It was an age of giants, of knowledge, of corruption that spread through all flesh. But what if that corruption wasn't just moral? What if it was technological? What if the world before the flood had built cities, towers, and monuments that rivaled our own? And what if the evidence is still there, buried under thousands of years of earth and water? In 1997, two geologists, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, were mapping the Black Sea. What they found stunned them: a shelf of ancient seabed, 300 feet below the surface, lined with the remains of freshwater shells, proof that this area had once been dry land. Their conclusion: around 5600 BC, a massive wall of seawater from the Mediterranean burst through the Bosporus Strait, flooding the basin with 10 cubic miles of water every day. Villages, farms, entire cultures vanished beneath the waves. It was, by every measure, a global flood, not in size, but in impact. And for those who lived through it, it must have felt like the end of the world. But here's where it gets strange. Other flood legends, from Mesopotamia, Sumer, Egypt, and even Central America, describe the same event, almost word for word. A god warning a man to build a vessel, a deluge destroying the wicked, and a handful of survivors who rebuild civilization after the waters recede. Coincidence? Or memory? If these stories all come from the same root event, then that root must have been real, and devastating enough to imprint itself on humanity's DNA. And that brings us to one question archaeologists have quietly begun to ask. What if the story of Noah wasn't just a moral parable, but a historical record of a civilization we've forgotten? In the southern plains of Iraq, near the ruins of ancient Ur, teams have unearthed evidence of a flood layer, a band of sterile silt, nearly 8 feet thick, sandwiched between two periods of human habitation. Below the flood layer, pottery, tools, and brickwork from a thriving city. Above it, a simpler, scattered community starting over. That single layer marks something catastrophic, a moment when time itself seemed to reset. One archaeologist, Sir Leonard Woolley, called it the line between the world that was and the world that began again. It's hard not to hear echoes of Genesis. All flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth, and the waters prevailed exceedingly. But here's what most people miss. The Bible never says where Noah lived. It only says he built an ark, and that when the flood ended, it came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat. But the world before that, the one that drowned, remains a mystery. And maybe that's why so many cultures speak of a lost city, before the flood. A place where humanity reached for the heavens and paid the price. Some call it Eridu, the oldest known city on Earth. Its ruins still lie in southern Mesopotamia, near the waters of the ancient Persian Gulf. Archaeologists date it to nearly 5400 BC, the exact time many believe the flood struck. In the oldest Sumerian records, Eridu was called the first city, the home of the gods. Its king, according to legend, ruled before the flood. And after the deluge, the kingship was said to descend again from heaven. That wording is nearly identical to Genesis, where God grants dominion, removes it through judgment, and then restores it through covenant. The parallels are impossible to ignore. So what if Eridu was not just a myth, but the memory of the world that perished? A world that mixed divine knowledge with human ambition, that mastered tools and art, and that used both to build towers reaching toward heaven. Sound familiar? Because only a few generations after the flood, another city would rise. Babel, a mirror image of the first. Two cities, two judgments, both born from the same desire to become gods without God. Maybe that's why the flood wasn't just punishment, it was protection, a divine reset, to erase what humanity had built without him so that he could begin again through one family that still listened. Because for all the ruins buried beneath sand and sea, the flood's real message isn't about destruction, it's about restraint. A God who allowed the waters to rise, not to end the world, but to preserve the possibility of grace. They say history repeats itself. But what if it doesn't repeat? What if it returns? Before the Ark, before Noah, the world was already advanced, not in technology as we know it, not electricity or machines, but in understanding, language, and the manipulation of the natural world. The Bible gives us only a hint. In those days, the sons of God came unto the daughters of men. It's one of Scripture's most debated lines, interpreted by some as angels, others as rulers or kings. But whatever they were, their union with humanity produced something the Bible calls Nephilim, the giants, the mighty men of old. They were the builders of the age before the flood. And according to ancient records, Sumerian, Babylonian, and Hebrew alike, their wisdom was vast, their pride greater. Archaeologists still puzzle over ruins that seem older than civilization itself. Megalithic stones fitted with precision even modern tools can't explain. Cities laid out with astronomical alignment thousands of years before written history. Most dismiss these anomalies as coincidences. But what if they're echoes, remnants of a world erased, a civilization that lived, learned, and vanished before time began again? Ancient Sumerian tablets, some of the oldest writings known, tell of kings who ruled before the flood. Their reigns lasted not decades but centuries. They built canals, temples, and towers in a land called Eridu, and the texts describe their end simply. Then the flood swept over, and kingship descended again from heaven. If that's true, then humanity didn't begin in ignorance, it began in greatness. And maybe that's what made the flood necessary. The Bible says, the earth was filled with violence, but the Hebrew word used, shamas, also means corruption, decay, pollution. Not just moral corruption, but the distortion of what God had made. Maybe the world before the flood wasn't just sinful. Maybe it was tampering with creation itself. Here's where science quietly meets Scripture. Geneticists studying ancient DNA have found evidence of a sudden population bottleneck, a point where humanity's genetic diversity dropped sharply, as if the entire human race had been reduced to a few families. The timing? Roughly between 10,000 and 5,000 BC. That aligns almost exactly with the period of sudden flood layers found across Mesopotamia and beyond. To the secular eye, it's coincidence. To the believer, it's confirmation. The flood wasn't myth, it was memory. But what kind of world had to exist before a reset that drastic? Imagine it, a global civilization connected by trade and shared knowledge. Sumer, Egypt, Indus, all rising nearly at once, as if remembering something they'd lost. Every culture's creation myth begins the same way, with knowledge descending from heaven. The Babylonians called them the Apkallu, the Greeks the Titans, the Hebrews the Watchers. Different names, same pattern, divine wisdom, human corruption, catastrophic judgment. But the question that lingers is this: why would God destroy not just the wicked, but the world itself? The answer lies in Genesis 6:12. All flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. All flesh, not just mankind. It suggests the corruption had gone deeper, into animals, plants, the very fabric of creation. The world itself had become incompatible with life as God designed it. So the flood wasn't vengeance. It was surgery. The cleansing of a planet that had infected itself with pride. In Eridu, archaeologists uncovered layers of temples stacked on top of one another, each built over the last, each more elaborate, each reaching higher. At the bottom lay the oldest, a simple platform of clay and stone. At the top, a tower, a pattern that would repeat again in Babel. Humanity always reaching upward to recreate what it once had in Eden. Every civilization that rises does so chasing the same memory. A paradise lost, a knowledge once shared, a light once dimmed. That longing, that instinct to build, to transcend, it's part of us. But when that longing turns to pride, it leads to ruin. And every time we reach too high, the waters return. The pre-flood world wasn't destroyed because God hated what humanity became. It was destroyed because he loved what humanity still could be. Sometimes mercy looks like judgment. Sometimes grace comes as a storm. Because to begin again, something first must end, so Noah's story isn't the tale of one man who survived a flood. It's the story of how the Creator restarted the world. And maybe that's why traces of that ancient civilization remain buried, just deep enough for us to find, but not enough for us to repeat. Because perhaps what we call discovery, he calls warning. The rain did not begin as a storm, it began as a whisper, a mist on the horizon that grew heavier each hour until it felt like the sky itself had opened. For generations, the world before Noah had ignored the warnings. Life continued as it always had. People built, traded, and celebrated beneath the weight of a sky that was about to fall. Noah was not a king, not a prophet by his own claim. He was a builder, working quietly on something that made no sense to anyone around him. The earth was dry, the rivers still flowed, and yet he built a vessel large enough to carry a world. To his neighbors it was madness, to heaven it was mercy. When the first drops of rain fell, it must have seemed like any other storm. Then came the sound, not thunder but a roar, as if the sea itself had broken loose. Water from above and below, swallowing fields, homes, temples, and towers. Everything humanity had built disappeared beneath the rising flood. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of sudden, catastrophic flooding across multiple regions. Layers of clay and silt show a world that drowned in a single season, then started over. To science, it looks like nature's reset. To faith, it was divine restraint. Because the flood was never meant to erase life, it was meant to preserve it. Noah's Ark is more than a story about survival. It is a record of preservation through obedience. A man who built when no one believed, who endured when the rest refused to listen. Inside that vessel was everything needed to begin again. The breath of creation sealed in wood and pitch. Every culture carries its own echo of this story. The Mesopotamians spoke of a man named Utnapishtim, who built a boat to survive the god's wrath. The Greeks spoke of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who repopulated the earth after a deluge. Across continents and languages, the same memory appears. A flood, a survivor, a renewal. It is not coincidence, it is collective memory. A trauma so massive it imprinted itself on every civilization that followed. When the waters receded, the world was not the same. The landscape was stripped bare. Mountains shifted, rivers changed course. Humanity had to learn to live again. Noah stepped out onto soil that had never known footsteps. The air was different, thinner, cleaner, colder. The silence must have felt endless. Then he built an altar. That act was not about gratitude alone. It was about restoration. The first sacrifice of the new world was a bridge between the old and the new, between judgment and mercy. It was a reminder that God had not abandoned creation. He had renewed it. The covenant came next. The rainbow was not a decoration. It was a weapon laid down. In ancient language, the word for bow is the same as the word for weapon. When God set his bow in the sky, it symbolized the end of hostility, the promise that water would never again destroy the earth. The flood was over, but its echo remains. Every storm, every tidal wave, every natural disaster reminds us how fragile our world is, and how quickly we can return to chaos when pride overtakes gratitude. In a way, the flood is not just ancient history, it is a mirror. Humanity continues to build cities that reach for heaven, technologies that promise salvation, and ideologies that replace faith with power. The same ambition that filled the pre-flood world is alive today, hidden beneath progress and pride. Maybe that is why the story still matters. It is not about water and wood. It is about warning and renewal. The Ark was not a ship built to escape judgment. It was a vessel built to carry grace. And maybe the real miracle was not that Noah survived, but that humanity was allowed to start over at all. Every culture tells its story of the beginning. Only one tells of a second beginning. That is the heart of the covenant, the belief that even after ruin, life can rise again. The flood was the end of the first world, but not the end of God's plan. It was the cleansing before the promise, the silence before redemption. And when the rainbow appeared over the new earth, it was not a symbol of what was lost. It was a reminder of what was still possible. Because the world that began after the flood was built on something the first one had forgotten. Faith. And faith, even in the smallest remnant, is enough to rebuild everything. The flood ended, but the story did not. When the waters withdrew, they left behind more than a new world. They left a reminder, a pattern that runs through every generation that followed. The first world was washed away, not because God wanted to end creation, but because he wanted to save it from itself. What began with destruction ended with a covenant. Noah stood beneath a sky still dripping with rain, looking at a horizon that had never existed before. The air smelled of earth and salt and silence. The ground was new, the mountains unfamiliar. There were no cities, no towers, no monuments. Only the promise of a beginning. He built an altar and offered a sacrifice, not to earn favor but to give thanks. He had witnessed the end of everything and still found grace. The covenant that followed changed the course of human history. The rainbow that stretched across the sky was not a symbol of survival. It was a declaration of restraint. The storm had passed, and with it the wrath that had once filled the heavens. It meant that judgment would never again come through water. It meant that mercy now had the final word. Generations later, that same promise would echo again, not in the sky, but on a hill outside Jerusalem. There, another form of covenant was made. This one not carved in stone or sealed in color, but written in blood. The first covenant was about survival. The second was about salvation. Both were acts of mercy. The flood and the cross are mirror images of each other. In one, water covered the earth. In the other, grace covered sin. In both, God was not ending the world. He was redeeming it. From Noah to Abraham, from Moses to Christ, the pattern remains the same. Sin, judgment, renewal, promise. Each time the world breaks, each time God rebuilds. And maybe that is why the story of the flood still speaks today. Because we are still surrounded by waters, not of rain, but of noise, fear, pride, and ambition. Humanity still builds towers, still reaches upward to be like gods, still forgets who gave it breath. But even now, above every storm, the promise still stands. Every sunrise is another chance to begin again. Every act of forgiveness is another covenant renewed. The rainbow is more than light through mist. It is the shape of patience, stretched across time itself. When Noah looked up at that sky, he did not see color. He saw mercy. And that same mercy still arcs over us now, even when we fail to notice it. Maybe that is why God told Noah to remember the sign, not to explain it. Because faith is not built on understanding. It is built on trust. The flood reminds us that judgment is real, but so is grace. It reminds us that everything can be washed away and still be made new. In the end, the waters recede and the covenant remains. The bough still hangs, the promise still stands, and the same God who guided the ark through the flood still guides the world through its storms. The promise after the waters was not just for Noah, it was for all who would come after him. For every soul that would look at the sky and wonder if the world could ever be restored. It can. It already was, and it still is. If you want to learn more about the Bible, the stories behind its mysteries, and the truth written between its lines, subscribe now. There are more stories waiting to be uncovered.